This is part 2 of my series on Latin American Voseo versus tuteo. Part 1 of this series covered where Voseo comes from, what it means, and which regions of Latin America use it. In this video, we'll discuss the grammar of Voseo, how to use it properly, how to conjugate verbs in Voseo, and the important regional variations of Voseo. Alright, so with the foundation of the information in Part 1, let's learn how to use Voseo. To start with, the pronoun vos itself is only used as the subject of a verb phrase or the object of a preposition. In all other positions, Voseo uses the same pronouns and possessive adjectives as tuteo. Let's look at some examples where we compare tuteo and Voseo. Tú hablas muy bien. Vos hablas muy bien. ¿Dónde vives tú? ¿Dónde vivís vos? Tú comes mucho. Vos comes mucho. Observe that where tú is the subject pronoun in the examples on the left, vos is the subject pronoun in the examples on the right. Let's look at some more examples. Lo hice para ti. Lo hice para vos. Quiero bailar contigo. Quiero bailar con vos. No voy sin ti. No voy sin vos. Observe that where ti is the object of the preposition in the examples on the left, vos is the object of the preposition in the examples on the right. This same pattern is seen with all prepositions. But as I said earlier, all other pronouns and possessive adjectives in Voseo are the same as those in tuteo. Next, let's discuss how to conjugate verbs in Voseo. Again, there is a lot of overlap between the verb conjugations of tuteo and Voseo. In fact, in the most common use of Voseo, the verb conjugations are exactly the same as those of tuteo in every tense and mood except for the normal present tense, what textbooks call the present tense indicative, and the command form, what textbooks call the affirmative imperative. Let's first look at examples where vos and tú are exactly the same. Alright, now let's compare tuteo and Voseo in the verb conjugations in which the two are different from one another. Let's start with the normal present tense. Tú hablas, vos hablas. Tú comes, vos comes. Tú vives, vos vivís. Tú tienes, vos tenés. Tú haces, vos haces. Tú vienes, vos venís. Tú dices, vos decís. Tú puedes, vos podés. Tú sabes, vos sabés. Okay, so what's going on here? One obvious observation is that in tuteo, the accent falls on the second to last syllable, while in Voseo, the accent falls on the last syllable. Another is that in IR verbs, the final I doesn't change to an E. And one last observation is that E to IE, E to I, and O to UE stem changes don't occur in Voseo. These three observations sum up pretty well how to conjugate in the normal present tense in Voseo. A few more simple observations and we'll know everything we need to know about conjugating in Voseo in the present tense. Ir, haber, and estar are all conjugated exactly the same way in Voseo as they are in tuteo. There is only one truly irregular Voseo verb form in the present tense, and that is the verb ser, which is conjugated sos. Great. Now let's look at the command form and see how tuteo and Voseo compare. Habla, habla. Háblame, háblame. Come, come. Cómelo, cómelo. Sube, subí. Ten, tené. haz, hace, házmelo, hacémelo, ven, vení, siéntate, sentate. All right, so what observations can we make about Voseo in the command form? Once again, in Voseo the accent falls on the last syllable instead of the second to last. There are no stem changes. In IR verbs, the final I does not become an E. Pronouns are attached to the end of the verb in Voseo, just as they are in tuteo. And finally, all those verbs that are irregular in tuteo are regular in Voseo. In fact, there is probably only one special case we need to discuss at all, and that is the verb ir. If you apply our observations to conjugating the verb ir in the command form of Voseo, you would just get I, which doesn't seem like much of a word. Consequently, most natives opt for using a completely different verb, a synonym of ir, andar. So where tuteo speakers say ve or vete, Voseo speakers generally say anda or andate. At this point, I would like to correct a misunderstanding lots of people have about where Voseo verb conjugations come from. Because most teachers do what I have done here and compare tuteo and Voseo verb forms, it's easy to come away with the idea that Voseo verb conjugations are derived from tuteo verb conjugations, or that historically, Voseo verb forms evolved from tuteo verb forms. The mistaken idea is that Voseo verb forms came into being as Spanish speakers moved the stressed accent from the second to last syllable to the last syllable. This is not true at all. The fact is that centuries ago, Voseo verb conjugations evolved from the verb forms that are today associated with vosotros in Spain. They evolved as Spanish speakers stopped pronouncing the E sound from the final diphthongs in the present tense conjugations, and stopped pronouncing the final D in command form conjugations. This clarification on where Voseo verb conjugations come from may not be terribly important for an average Spanish student, but it does explain all of the observations we've just made. It explains why the accent falls on the last syllable, why Voseo doesn't have stem changes, and why there are only a couple irregular conjugations. It also explains the regional variations in Voseo that we're going to discuss now. The first major regional variation has to do with the subjunctive and the negative command forms. In the Rio Platense dialects, which include those spoken in Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina, it's considered most proper to use Voseo verb conjugations only for the present tense and command forms. So if you plan on living or traveling in any of those countries, you don't have to learn anything about Voseo other than what we've talked about up to this point. You're done. However, some people in the Rio Platense regions, as well as pretty much all Voseo speakers in Central America, Colombia, and Bolivia, also conjugate verbs differently for Voseo in the subjunctive and negative command forms. Fortunately, these conjugations are extremely easy to derive simply by applying the trends we've already observed for conjugating in Voseo. The general idea is that you conjugate the verb the same way as for tuteo, only with the accent on the last syllable instead of the second to last syllable. You could also think of it as conjugating them the same as for vosotros, only dropping the I from the last diphthong. Either way, you get the same result. Observe that in the subjunctive and negative command, Voseo has the same irregular forms as tuteo. The last significant regional variation of Voseo that we need to discuss is the Chilean variety. As I mentioned in part 1 of this series, Chilean Voseo is unique. It's also complicated enough that a simple summary doesn't do it justice. So as to not cast any confusion over the material we've covered so far, and to keep this video from being too long, I think it's best to save the topic of Chilean Voseo until later, and develop it in a separate video of its own. Alright, so this has been my contribution to the topic of Latin American Voseo versus tuteo. I find it to be a fascinating subject in Latin American dialectology, and I hope you found these 2 videos interesting and useful. As always, I know that there is more to be said on the subject, but for typical beginning and intermediate students, I feel that this introduction has been more than enough. If you have any questions or contributions, feel free to make them in the comments below.